Hey folks, tonight we're diving headfirst into one of the most bizarre, questionable, and occasionally eyebrow-raising parts of life in the medieval world: personal hygiene. Or more specifically, the wildly inconsistent, often experimental, and sometimes outright dangerous ways people of the Middle Ages tried to stay clean, smell acceptable, and avoid dropping dead from a mystery rash. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of medieval bathhouses, DIY dental disasters, and how society collectively decided that soap was optional, take a moment to gently scrub that like button until it shines, and hit subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy exploring history's weirdest corners with me. And hey, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always love seeing how far this little internet tavern of ours reaches across the world. All right, settle in. Maybe light a candle for that authentic medieval vibe and brace yourself, because tonight we're washing away the myths and grime to uncover the absurd reality of hygiene in the Middle Ages. Picture this. It's the year 1224. You're a young apprentice working under the town's wheelwright, spending your days hauling timber, hammering spokes, and dodging your master's suspiciously aggressive goat. The sun's been baking your tunic all afternoon. Your hands are caked with sweat, grease, and who knows what from the workshop floor. You'd love nothing more than a long, hot bath to rinse the misery off. But here's the problem. Bathing isn't exactly a straightforward business in your world. You see, medieval people weren't strangers to washing, despite the popular myth that everyone from peasants to kings just marinated in filth until their bodies gave out. The truth is, people did wash. They just did it differently, irregularly, and with varying levels of success depending on where they lived, how much coin they had, and how willing they were to risk public bathhouse diseases. Let's start with the humble peasants. The backbone of medieval society, the folks working the fields, tending livestock, and spending most days ankle-deep in mud, manure, and mystery puddles. For them, hygiene was less about luxury and more about survival, though their definition of clean wouldn't exactly pass a modern spa checklist. Bathing often meant a quick splash in the nearest stream, or washing hands and face with rainwater collected in barrels. Full-body baths? Rare. Not impossible, but rare. Water had to be hauled, heated, and poured into wooden tubs, which wasn't exactly easy when you're already exhausted from a 14-hour workday chasing sheep and dodging tax collectors. But despite the hardships, peasants understood the basic concept of hygiene. They just had to get creative. Herbal rinses, vinegar scrubs, and even sand were used to clean the skin, exfoliate, or scrub away grime. Smelling fresh? That was trickier. Many turned to flowers, rosemary sprigs, or simply avoided crowded spaces after 3 days without a rinse. Meanwhile, in bustling medieval towns, bathhouses emerged, and they were far from the sterile wellness retreats you might be picturing. Imagine a cramped, steamy wooden shack tucked behind a tavern, filled with lukewarm water, questionable steam, and a mixed crowd of merchants, bakers, traveling performers, and the occasional pickpocket lurking in the mist. Bathhouses were social hubs, but they were also a gamble. Sure, you could wash off the day's grime, but you might leave with a new rash, lice, or a scandalous rumor following your footsteps. Interestingly, bathhouses weren't strictly divided by gender, at least not everywhere. In some towns, mixed bathing was normal, even encouraged, leading to an environment that was part hygiene ritual, part social mixer, and occasionally, part medieval dating service. It wasn't unheard of for business deals, courtships, and gossip to flourish right alongside scrubbing and soaking. And if you're wondering, yes, that often led to moral outrage. Local clergy and town officials frequently clashed over bathhouse culture, with some branding them as dens of sin and temptation, though few could deny they were effective places to wash and warm up during harsh winters. But not everyone had access to communal baths. Wealthier townsfolk often had private tubs, large wooden barrels, copper basins, or even elaborate stone baths for the truly rich. Servants or apprentices would lug in gallons of heated water, and with the help of scented oils, herbs, and an alarming amount of effort, the wealthy could enjoy something resembling a relaxing soak. Of course, draining and refilling those baths was labor-intensive, so unless you had an entire household staff, the water didn't always get changed between uses. Yes, that means sharing your bath water wasn't just polite, It was practical, albeit incredibly gross by today's standards. Let's not forget, this is a time long before modern plumbing, antibacterial soap, or even the faintest understanding of germ theory. Most people believed illness came from imbalanced humors, bad air, or, according to some superstitions, angry spirits lurking in the bathhouse steam. So while people did wash, they often skipped the soap entirely, opting instead for coarse cloths, abrasive herbs, or sand to physically scrub themselves clean. And the results? Mixed, at best. Sure, some towns had surprisingly sophisticated public sanitation efforts, aqueducts, drainage ditches, even rudimentary sewer systems. But for most folks, cleanliness was as much about appearances as it was about actual hygiene. Smelling vaguely floral? Victory. Scrubbing away dirt stains? Bonus. Avoiding infections? Pure luck. Even hair care was a medieval adventure. People brushed, combed, and occasionally doused their hair with oils or herbal infusions. But washing with water was infrequent, especially during colder months. Long hair was common for both men and women, a symbol of health, status, and in some cases religious devotion. But lice? Oh, lice were basically medieval roommates. Nitpicking, literally, was a daily chore, with special combs designed to remove lice and their eggs. Some folks even powdered their hair with flour or crushed herbs to absorb oil and mask odors, a practice that lingered well into later centuries. Meanwhile, let's talk about teeth, or what passed for dental hygiene back then. Toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist yet, but that didn't stop people from trying to maintain their smiles, especially the upper classes who valued appearance as much as health. Chewing sticks, slender twigs frayed at one end, acted as primitive brushes. People rubbed their teeth with linen cloths or rinsed with vinegar, wine, or salt water to keep their breath tolerable and hopefully avoid losing too many teeth before 35. And while we're on the subject, dentistry was, to put it gently, medieval. If you had a toothache, your options included yanking the offending tooth out with pliers, applying herbal poultices, or, if you were extremely unlucky, visiting the local barber-surgeon for an extraction that involved more screaming than anesthesia. Dental hygiene wasn't non-existent, but let's just say smiling wide in medieval Europe was a bold choice. Of course, cultural attitudes towards hygiene varied wildly across regions. In some parts of the Islamic world, for example, personal cleanliness was deeply embedded in daily religious practices, with frequent washing and sophisticated bathhouse systems. Travelers returning to Europe from such regions often marveled, or recoiled, at the difference in hygiene standards. Yet even within medieval Europe, things weren't entirely bleak. Certain cities had public fountains, organized waste removal, and hygiene rituals tied to festivals or religious observances. But for the average medieval villager, staying clean was an exhausting balancing act. Water wasn't always safe, soap was expensive or unavailable, and social norms dictated how much dirt you could wear before people started whispering behind your back. Yet people persisted. They scrubbed with sand, scented themselves with herbs, and braved dubious bathhouses, all in the name of cleanliness, status, or, occasionally, impressing that cute merchant's apprentice at the market. All right, that's our first step into the murky waters of medieval hygiene. And trust me, it only gets weirder from here. Now that we've scrubbed away the surface-level grime of medieval bathing rituals, let's lean into a topic even more curious: cosmetics, personal grooming, and the medieval obsession with appearances, even when medical science hadn't quite caught up with beauty trends. You might assume that medieval folks, scraping by in mud-streaked villages or drafty castles, didn't care much about vanity, but you'd be wrong. Despite the fleas, questionable hygiene, and occasional plague outbreaks, people cared a lot about how they looked, sometimes enough to risk their health for the sake of a paler face or shinier hair. Let's start with the most coveted beauty standard of the time: fair, luminous skin. In medieval Europe, pale skin wasn't just attractive, it was a billboard for your social status. Tanned skin implied you worked outdoors, farming, hauling goods, or herding livestock. But porcelain-like complexions? That screamed wealth, leisure, and the luxury of avoiding sunlight entirely. So people got creative. Some concocted face powders from ground alabaster, chalk or crushed pearls, while the wealthier elites turned to recipes containing vinegar, egg whites, or, brace yourself, white lead. Yes, lead. Because nothing says radiant glow like slow poisoning and peeling skin, lead-based cosmetics were shockingly common, used not just to lighten the skin but to conceal blemishes, scars from smallpox, or the ravages of poor hygiene. The irony? While trying to look healthier and more youthful, people often damaged their skin, suffered from chronic illness, or even shortened their lifespan, all in pursuit of beauty ideals that wouldn't look out of place on a modern runway. But skin wasn't the only battlefield in the medieval beauty war. Hair care, while inconsistent, was also a crucial marker of status and appeal. Women, especially among the nobility, grew their hair long, braided it elaborately, and adorned it with ribbons, veils, or jeweled nets. For those with enough means, oils made from rosemary, lavender, or bay leaves were massaged into the scalp to add shine and scent. Men, meanwhile, styled their hair to signal everything from religious devotion to political allegiance. Beards came and went in popularity, at times seen as symbols of masculinity, wisdom, or rebellion, depending on who was ruling and which saint's image people were imitating that decade. But no discussion of medieval grooming is complete without mentioning the nose, specifically what people did to survive the overwhelming smells of daily life. Imagine narrow streets packed with livestock, rotting waste, and overworked bodies all simmering under the sun. Even the wealthiest manor couldn't completely escape the symphony of stench drifting from the town below. So people fought back, not with modern deodorants or air fresheners, but with perfumes, pomanders, and scented sachets. Perfume wasn't new. By the 12th century, thanks to trade with the Islamic world and parts of Asia, Europe had access to fragrant oils, resins, and exotic spices. Those who could afford them carried little pomanders, intricately carved metal spheres filled with herbs, flowers, or scented resins, dangling from belts or necklaces to mask unpleasant odors. Some even filled their sleeves or gloves with fragrant materials, turning everyday gestures into subtle olfactory escapes. It wasn't just about smelling pleasant, it was believed that sweet scents could protect against disease. The logic, flawed as it was, came from the miasma theory, the belief that illness spread through bad air. So keeping fragrant herbs or flowers close wasn't just fashionable, it was survival strategy, or so they thought. Beyond perfume, cosmetics extended to makeup that enhanced the eyes, darkened eyebrows, or added artificial rosiness to cheeks and lips, all made from plant extracts, mineral powders, or animal byproducts. And much like today, there was constant debate over how much was too much. Church officials frequently condemned excessive cosmetics, warning that altering God's creation with powders and potions was vanity at best, deception at worst. But that didn't stop people from painting their faces or highlighting their features, especially during festivals, religious feasts, or royal gatherings where appearance could make or break your social prospects. Even fingernails weren't entirely neglected. Though less elaborate than today's manicures, clean, well-maintained hands indicated refinement. Laborers had rough, calloused hands stained by work, but nobility prided themselves on soft, pale skin and neatly trimmed nails, sometimes rubbed with oils or balms to prevent cracking. It's easy to imagine medieval people as perpetually dirty, disheveled, and unconcerned with appearances, but peel back the layers of folklore, and you find a society just as obsessed with beauty, status, and self-expression as any influencer scrolling their feed today. They just lacked dermatologists, fluoride, and functioning sewage systems to back it all up. And that meant beauty often came at a steep, sometimes deadly cost. All right, are you ready to move forward? We're just scratching the surface of medieval life, and trust me, it gets wilder from here. Now that we've uncovered the lengths people went to in order to look presentable, let's dive even deeper, quite literally, into the realm of medieval healthcare, where treatments were experimental, outcomes questionable, and sometimes your best hope for recovery involved equal parts luck, divine intervention, and a sturdy tolerance for discomfort. Picture this. You've woken up with a fever, your head feels like it's been trampled by a mule, your joints ache, and there's an ominous red rash creeping up your arm. You live in the year 1289. Your village healer has the medical knowledge of a modern kindergarten science class, and the nearest physician is 3 towns away, assuming they're sober, competent, or even alive. What do? If you're lucky, you might stumble into the hands of the town's apothecary, a person equal parts herbalist, chemist, and hopeful guesser. Their shop is a cluttered haven of dried herbs, animal bones, bottled concoctions, and scrolls containing half-understood remedies copied from ancient texts. Maybe they prescribe a poultice of marigold and honey for your rash. Not a terrible idea, actually, given honey's antibacterial properties. But then, they might also suggest hanging a dead toad around your neck to draw out the sickness. Science? Not quite. But in a world without germ theory, people clung to rituals, herbs, and ancient teachings to stay alive. Physicians, when available, operated with more authority, but not always more accuracy. Their knowledge came from Greek, Roman, and Arabic medical texts passed down over generations, often filtered through layers of translation errors and religious interpretations. The dominant theory? Humoral medicine. The belief that health depended on balancing 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of one? You got sick. The cure? Balance the humors, often through methods that sound more like medieval torture than healthcare. Bloodletting was a favorite, slicing veins or applying leeches to drain excess blood and restore equilibrium. Did it work? Occasionally by sheer coincidence, but often it weakened patients further, leading to more infections or an accelerated appointment with the afterlife. Cupping, where heated glass or metal cups were applied to the skin to create suction, was another common treatment, believed to draw out impurities. Other times, physicians prescribed laxatives, emetics, or sweat-inducing concoctions to purge the body of sickness, treatments that left patients bedridden, dehydrated, and desperately questioning their life choices. Surgery? That was a terrifying last resort. Performed without anesthesia beyond strong wine or the occasional wooden stick to bite, surgical procedures ranged from crude amputations to attempts at removing tumors or setting broken bones. Barbers often doubled as surgeons, which meant the same person trimming your beard might also be stitching up your sword wound. Skilled? Sometimes. Sanitary? Rarely. But amidst the chaos, there were glimmers of progress. In larger cities, hospitals emerged, though they resembled religious hospices more than modern clinics. Run by monks, nuns, or charitable organizations, these institutions provided care for the sick, elderly, or travelers, offering basic shelter, food, and prayer. Medical knowledge wasn't uniform. In parts of the Islamic world, advanced practices like cataract surgery, antiseptic techniques, and detailed anatomical studies flourished. But in much of Europe, superstition often outweighed science. Illness was frequently blamed on moral failings, sin, or divine punishment, leading sufferers to seek salvation through confession, pilgrimage, or holy relics, rather than practical medicine. And yet, people endured. They brewed herbal teas, applied poultices, crafted balms from beeswax and herbs, and passed down folk remedies honed through generations of trial and error. Some worked, many didn't. But in a world where medical care hovered between hopeful guesswork and spiritual intervention, survival often hinged on resilience, community, and a willingness to try anything, even if it involved wearing herbs, swallowing crushed beetles, or trusting the local barber with both your haircut and your stitches. Medicine in the Middle Ages was as much about faith as it was about knowledge, and while the methods might make modern doctors shudder, they reflect humanity's relentless drive to heal, even when the odds, and the leeches, were stacked against them. Now that we've survived the questionable world of medieval medicine, it's time to explore another fundamental part of life: food. Because nothing quite reflects a society's culture, struggle, and creativity like what they put on their plates, or in many cases, what they desperately wished was on their plates. You see, the medieval dining experience was an elaborate balancing act between survival and status. Depending on where you stood on the social ladder, your daily meals could range from barely edible porridge to extravagant feasts that lasted for hours, with more courses than most modern weddings and enough roasted meat to populate a small zoo. But let's start at the roots. the fields, villages, and homes of ordinary folk. If you were a peasant in the year 1317, your daily meals were designed for one primary goal: keeping you alive through relentless labor. Breakfast might be a thick slice of coarse, dark bread, made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat was often reserved for the wealthier classes. With it, you might have a bit of cheese if the goats were cooperative that week, or a weak ale to wash it down, because as we've covered, water was sometimes more lethal than helpful. Lunch, if you could call it that, was usually a pottage, a kind of stew where grains, beans, root vegetables, and herbs simmered together into a filling, if bland, concoction. Sometimes scraps of meat, bacon, or fish made an appearance, but for most villagers, meat was a luxury reserved for holidays or feast days. Dinner followed a similar pattern: more bread, more pottage, maybe some dried fruit, nuts or preserved vegetables if the harvest had been kind. Spices were rare and expensive, often worth more than gold, so flavor was a regional affair, dictated by what herbs or garden finds were available. Salt was precious, essential for preserving meat and fish, and sometimes controlled by lords or monarchs to ensure political and economic leverage. But food wasn't purely functional. Even the poorest families celebrated with special dishes during festivals, weddings, or religious events. Honey cakes, roasted chestnuts, or spiced bread emerged as brief escapes from daily monotony. And speaking of escapes, let's climb the social ladder and peek inside the noble courts, where food wasn't just sustenance, it was spectacle. Imagine long tables covered with embroidered cloths, silver platters, and an endless parade of roasted meats, pies, tarts, and wines. Peacocks, their feathers reattached post-cooking for dramatic effect, graced banquet tables alongside intricately shaped jellies, marzipan sculptures, and whole animals stuffed with other animals in a display of culinary excess that would baffle a modern chef. Noble dining followed strict etiquette. Meals unfolded in courses, each accompanied by music, entertainment, and enough toasting to blur social tensions. The wealthy flaunted their access to exotic spices, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, imported along treacherous trade routes from the East, their presence a bold symbol of status and global connection. Fish held a special place in noble and religious diets, especially during fasting periods when meat was forbidden. Rivers and lakes were carefully managed to provide carp, pike, or eels, while the wealthiest imported delicacies like sturgeon or whale meat, though the latter was more about status than flavor. But perhaps the greatest divide in medieval food culture wasn't just between rich and poor. It was between town and countryside. In cities, bustling markets offered bread, cheese, dried fruits, meat pies, and the occasional sweetmeat, though food safety was more theory than practice. Rural families depended heavily on what they grew, raised, or foraged. Herbs, berries, mushrooms, and roots supplemented diets, with seasonal scarcity shaping every meal plan. Starvation wasn't a distant fear. It was a regular threat. Poor harvests, harsh winters, or political instability could turn food scarcity into widespread famine, reminding everyone that behind the grand feasts and noble banquets, survival often boiled down to a bowl of grain and a little luck. Yet even amid hardship, creativity thrived. Medieval cooks, from peasant mothers to castle chefs, experimented with limited ingredients, creating pies, stews, and breads that stretched rations and fed communities. Food wasn't merely fuel, it was family, tradition, and resilience, served up with whatever resources the land and seasons provided. So whether you were a village laborer gnawing on hard cheese and rye bread, or a lord savoring spiced roast swan under candlelight, food defined your place in society, and sometimes determined whether you saw the next sunrise. Are you ready to continue? Let me know, and we'll dive headfirst into the next fascinating chapter of medieval life. After filling our plates with medieval cuisine, it's only fair that we now explore how people unwound, celebrated, and entertained themselves in a world without smartphones, movie theaters, or the luxury of doom-scrolling through social media at 2 a.m. Because while life in the Middle Ages could be brutally hard, filled with plagues, labor, and unpredictable weather, people still found ways to laugh, play, and occasionally risk injury, all in the name of fun. Entertainment wasn't evenly distributed, of course. Your options depended heavily on your status, location, and just how much free time you could afford after working sunrise to sunset. But let's start where the fun was loudest: festivals and fairs. Picture the town square on market day transformed into a vibrant chaos of merchants, musicians, acrobats, and food stalls. Jugglers tossed knives into the air while street performers mimicked local officials, much to the delight, and sometimes horror, of the crowd. Wandering minstrels strummed lutes or hurdy-gurdies, singing songs about heroic knights, tragic lovers, or scandalous village gossip, often earning coin from impressed spectators or distracted drunks. Traveling theater troupes also made the rounds, performing mystery plays, morality tales, or satirical sketches, sometimes in makeshift stages, sometimes right on the church steps, blurring the line between spiritual lesson and comedic roast. These performances weren't just entertainment. They reinforced social values, religious teachings, and community bonds, all wrapped in humor, drama, and occasionally questionable special effects involving pig bladders and flour. But not all entertainment required an audience. Medieval folks invented games to pass the time, some simple, some surprisingly brutal. Children played with wooden dolls, hoops, and carved toys, while adults gathered for dice games, card games, or competitive board games like Nine Men's Morris, which resembled an early version of strategy games, mixing luck and tactics. Then there were sports. And by sports, I mean activities that blurred the line between athleticism and chaos. Take mob football, an early form of soccer that had almost no rules beyond kick the inflated animal bladder toward the opposing village. Entire communities participated. Matches spanned fields, rivers, and streets, and injuries were common enough that many towns had to ban the game during particularly busy seasons. Wrestling, archery contests, and hammer throwing were also popular, testing strength and skill, while tournaments provided the ultimate spectacle for both nobility and peasants alike. Imagine grand arenas set up on castle grounds, armored knights on horseback thundering toward each other with lances raised, the crowd roaring with every clash of steel. Tournaments were more than sport. They were displays of wealth, power, and chivalric ideals, complete with feasting, dancing, and the occasional flirtatious glance exchanged beneath a lady's elaborate veil. But the entertainment didn't stop there. Music and dance wove through daily life, from rustic village gatherings to elaborate court balls. Simple instruments like flutes, drums, and bagpipes filled taverns and fields, while wealthy households hired minstrels to perform during meals or special occasions. Dances varied by region, but circle dances, line formations, and couple routines all allowed people to socialize, show off, and, depending on the wine, test their balance. And of course, no mention of medieval entertainment is complete without the court jester. Part comedian, part musician, part social critic with a dangerously sharp tongue. Jesters entertained royalty with jokes, songs, riddles, and physical comedy. But their role wasn't purely frivolous. They could mock the king, expose hypocrisy, and speak uncomfortable truths disguised as humor, all while juggling or wearing absurd hats adorned with bells. For peasants, entertainment also came from storytelling. Long evenings by the fire listening to elders recount epic battles, ancient legends, or local ghost stories meant to both terrify and teach valuable lessons. These tales evolved with each telling, becoming part of the rich oral tradition that preserved history and shaped community identity. Whether through music, sport, theater, or spontaneous games involving excessive risk, medieval people carved out moments of joy, bonding, and release from the hardships of daily life, proving that even in the grittiest of eras, laughter and play were essential. Ready to continue? Let me know, and we'll leap into the next chapter of this wild medieval journey. We've explored how medieval folks ate, entertained themselves, and occasionally trusted their barber with both their hair and their life. But now let's wander into the shadowy world of medieval superstitions, where fear of the unknown, limited scientific understanding, and creative imagination combine to turn daily life into a constant dance with fate. You see, in a time before microscopes, meteorology, or germ theory, people searched for meaning in every flickering shadow and strange event. The rustle of leaves, the flight of birds, even a sudden itch. These could all carry hidden messages from the universe. and ignoring them could mean courting disaster. Let's start with the most universal concern of the age: protection from evil. From illness to crop failure to sudden death, the Middle Ages were filled with threats that seemed random, cruel, and beyond control. But to the medieval mind, these events weren't random. They were signs, punishments, or dark forces at play. So naturally, people armed themselves with charms, talismans, and rituals designed to tilt the odds back in their favor. It wasn't unusual to see villagers wearing amulets made from carved bone, iron, or even animal teeth, believed to ward off evil spirits or misfortune. Herbs like garlic, rosemary, or St. John's wort were hung above doors, worn in pouches, or burned as incense to create protective barriers against curses or malevolent forces. And don't even think about stepping over someone lying on the ground. Doing so was believed to trap their soul outside their body, causing illness or death, unless you stepped back over them to undo the cosmic mistake. But the superstitions didn't stop with personal protection. The natural world itself was a constant source of omens. Black cats crossing your path, a terrible sign in some villages, yet a blessing in others depending on local folklore. Crows circling overhead were often viewed as harbingers of death, while shooting stars could signal upcoming disasters or monumental change. Dreams, too, held immense power. A dream of losing teeth might foretell illness or death in the family. Dreaming of water? That could mean pregnancy, financial loss, or spiritual cleansing. Interpretations varied wildly, but few dared to dismiss them outright. Even the weather played into medieval fears. A sudden storm wasn't just bad luck. It might mean divine anger, witchcraft, or the opening of a gateway between worlds. Lightning striking a building was cause for immediate spiritual panic, often followed by urgent church visits and frantic confessionals. Speaking of churches, religious superstitions intertwined deeply with everyday fears. People collected holy relics, fragments of saints' bones, pieces of the true cross, or vials of holy water, believing these objects carried protective, healing, or even miraculous powers. Traveling merchants, both legitimate and less so, sold these relics, sometimes forging them entirely, knowing that desperate villagers would pay dearly for a sliver of divine insurance. Witches, of course, were the ultimate scapegoats when things went wrong. Crops failed, a neighbor's cow stopped producing milk, a child fell ill. It wasn't long before suspicious glances turned toward the outcast living on the village outskirts, especially if they owned a black cat, brewed herbs, or simply kept to themselves. Accusations often snowballed, fueled by superstition, fear, and the all-too-human desire to explain tragedy with a convenient villain. But not all medieval superstitions were dark or accusatory. Some aimed to invite good luck, fertility, or prosperity. Newlyweds might carry symbolic herbs down the aisle. Farmers planted by moon phases, and expectant mothers followed elaborate rituals to ensure healthy childbirth. Even ordinary greetings carried hidden rules. Saying "bless you" after a sneeze wasn't just polite, it was essential, believed to prevent the devil from sneaking into your body through your mouth. And let's not forget the infamous belief in lucky and unlucky days. Entire calendars were marked with ominous warnings, telling people when to avoid travel, weddings, or major decisions based on celestial alignments, feast days, or obscure prophecies passed down through generations. In short, medieval life was a tightrope walk through a world seen as unpredictable, mystical, and brimming with hidden forces, some benevolent, many malevolent. But through rituals, charms, and shared beliefs, people tried to carve out a sense of control amidst the uncertainty, weaving superstition into the fabric of daily survival. Having explored how medieval folks tried to protect themselves from misfortune with charms and omens, let's now venture beyond the village borders into the unpredictable world of medieval travel, where every journey was equal parts adventure, gamble, and survival test. You see, in an age without cars, trains, or flight tickets, getting from one place to another wasn't just inconvenient, it was often life-threatening. Roads were unreliable, maps were vague at best, and unless you were extraordinarily wealthy, you'd be traveling by foot, cart, or if fortune smiled, on horseback, navigating through dense forests, treacherous mountain passes, and muddy paths that vanished entirely after a storm. But despite the dangers, people traveled. They had to. Markets, fairs, and festivals drew merchants, performers, and traders across great distances. Pilgrimages sent thousands of devout souls on foot toward distant cathedrals, abbeys, or holy shrines, seeking healing, forgiveness, or spiritual enlightenment. Though many also hoped for adventure, social status, or simply a break from monotonous village life. Pilgrimage sites became bustling hubs of commerce and culture, from Canterbury to Santiago de Compostela, and even to the Holy Land for those brave or wealthy enough. People embarked on months-long journeys marked by hardship, camaraderie, and the constant risk of illness, bandits, or getting hopelessly lost. And it wasn't just religious motivation that drove travel. Trade routes snaked across continents, connecting towns and cities in a vast, uneven web of exchange. Merchants hauled spices, cloth, salt, and exotic goods along rivers, rough roads, or by sea, braving storms, pirates, and border tolls set by opportunistic lords eager to tax anything that moved. But travel was more than just commerce or faith. It reshaped identities, relationships, and communities. Wandering minstrels, scholars, and soldiers drifted between cities and courts, bringing songs, stories, and news from distant lands. Knights ventured to tournaments or wars, their journeys chronicled in exaggerated tales of valor and drama. Even ordinary villagers might leave home for seasonal work, laborers moving to harvest fields, skilled artisans traveling to build cathedrals, or desperate souls chasing rumors of better fortunes in distant markets. Yet every journey carried risk. Bandits prowled remote stretches of road, preying on the unwary or poorly defended. Weather could turn a simple trip into a survival ordeal. Flash floods, snowstorms, and impassable rivers often stranded travelers for days. And illness, with medieval medicine as we've explored, could strike far from home, leaving the sick vulnerable in unfamiliar towns where strangers might be more suspicious than helpful. Inns provided temporary refuge, but forget the cozy tavern scenes of romantic folklore. Many inns were little more than crowded rooms above alehouses shared with strangers and their fleas for a hefty price. Food was unpredictable, beds were rough, and theft or scuffles were common in poorly regulated establishments. Sea voyages? Those were an entirely different gamble. Creaky wooden ships battled unpredictable weather, rudimentary navigation, and the ever-present threat of pirates or shipwrecks. Crossing the Channel or Mediterranean could be a weeks-long ordeal, with seasickness, spoiled food, and cramped quarters testing the hardiest travelers' patience and stomachs. Yet despite the dangers, people yearned to see the world beyond their village church steeple. Stories of distant cities, grand markets, and legendary sites inspired generations to risk everything for a glimpse of life beyond the horizon. And sometimes those journeys reshaped history. Merchants returning with exotic spices, pilgrims carrying relics, scholars sharing new ideas sparked cultural shifts that rippled far beyond dusty roads and wind-battered ports. Travel in the Middle Ages was a test of endurance, faith, and adaptability. For those who survived, it was also a window into a vast, interconnected world brimming with wonder, danger, and possibilities, long before passports or guidebooks existed. After wandering the perilous roads of medieval travel, it's only fair we talk about what happened when those journeys, or life in general, led you into trouble, because medieval justice was a spectacle all its own, blending community expectations, superstition, and brutal creativity in equal measure. Let's start with the basics. If you lived in a medieval village and broke the law, maybe you stole a loaf of bread, insulted a noble, or got caught in a tavern brawl gone wrong, your fate wasn't decided by slick lawyers or complex legal codes. Instead, justice was often swift, public, and designed as much to humiliate as to punish. Local lords held court over their lands, resolving disputes, doling out punishments, and occasionally flexing their power to remind everyone who was in charge. Trials varied by region, but many shared one crucial feature. Evidence was secondary to social standing, reputation, and spectacle. Witnesses were important, sure, but so were oaths, character testimony, and the whims of whoever sat in judgment. If your neighbors liked you, maybe you walked away with a fine or a warning. If they didn't, well, let's just say stocks, pillories, or worse could be in your immediate future. For more serious crimes and theft, violence, blasphemy, or accusations of witchcraft, the medieval justice system cranked up the theatrics. Trials by ordeal were common, designed to let divine will decide your innocence or guilt. One popular method? The ordeal of hot iron, where you carried a heated metal bar for a set distance, then had your wounds bandaged and examined days later. If they healed cleanly, you were innocent. If they festered, well, clearly the heavens weren't on your side. Water ordeals flipped the logic. Accused witches or criminals were tied up and tossed into a pond or river. Floating meant guilt, as it implied rejection by the pure element of water. Sinking suggested innocence, though the obvious problem was that many innocent people didn't exactly resurface in time to enjoy their freedom. Punishments, when handed down, were rarely subtle. Stocks and pillories trapped offenders in wooden frames, exposing them to public ridicule, thrown vegetables, or worse. It wasn't just about discomfort. It was a community event, turning justice into public theater where lessons were learned at someone else's expense. More severe sentences included branding, mutilation, or exile, the latter often as good as a death sentence if you had no resources or allies. Execution was reserved for the most extreme crimes or political betrayals, carried out with varying degrees of efficiency and decorum. Beheadings were seen as merciful for nobles, while commoners faced hangings, burnings, or other grisly ends, often attended by crowds hungry for both justice and entertainment. But not every legal matter ended in disaster. Disputes over land, inheritance, or trade were often settled through arbitration, negotiations, or community councils. In some towns, merchant guilds and craft associations enforced their own rules, maintaining order among members while shielding them from harsher external courts. And religion played its part. Churches offered sanctuary to fugitives, at least temporarily, forcing lords or officials to negotiate terms or wait out the sanctuary period before action could be taken. Justice in the Middle Ages wasn't blind. It wore the colors of power, reputation, and social hierarchy. The wealthy could buy leniency, the influential could sway verdicts, and the marginalized often faced the harshest penalties. But for all its flaws and brutalities, medieval justice reflected a world desperate to maintain order amidst chaos, where law and punishment walked hand in hand with fear, spectacle, and the constant gamble of survival. We've explored medieval justice, travel, food, hygiene, and entertainment, but no deep dive into this chaotic chapter of history would be complete without untangling the complex, often contradictory world of love, marriage, and family life in the Middle Ages. Because contrary to the popular image of arranged political unions and cold-hearted transactions, medieval relationships were messy, emotional, and sometimes surprisingly romantic. But they were also tightly woven into survival, social status, and economics. Let's start with courtship, or what passed for dating when Tinder was still several centuries away. In villages and towns, young people met at markets, festivals, church gatherings, and, yes, those raucous tavern nights where music and ale lowered inhibitions faster than any formal introduction could. Flirting wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Songs, dances, sly glances, and playful teasing filled these events, giving potential couples a chance to assess each other, albeit under the watchful eyes of family and community. But love alone rarely sealed the deal. Marriage, especially among the lower classes, was as much about practicality as passion. Families negotiated alliances based on land, livestock, labor, and security. A marriageable daughter wasn't just a future wife. She was an economic asset, her union carefully weighed against the needs of both families involved. Dowries, the goods, money, or property a bride's family provided, played a critical role, influencing marriage prospects and shaping family dynamics for years to come. Among the wealthy and noble classes, marriage negotiations were even more intense. Unions forged political alliances, secured territories, and bolstered family prestige. Children, particularly daughters, were often pawns in these strategic games, betrothed as young as 10 or 12, their fates sealed in ink long before they understood the implications. But even in these arranged matches, affection sometimes blossomed. Letters, poems, and gifts exchanged between noble couples revealed tenderness, longing, and even genuine love, though that didn't exempt them from the complicated duty-bound expectations of medieval matrimony. Weddings themselves varied dramatically depending on social status and region. Peasant weddings were communal affairs, simple, lively, often involving food, drink, music, and the occasional brawl if too much ale flowed before the vows. Noble weddings, by contrast, were grand spectacles of wealth, with feasts stretching for days, elaborate garments, and ceremonies that blended religious solemnity with political theater. But the real work began after the wedding. Marriage wasn't seen as a romantic conclusion. It was a partnership meant to produce heirs, manage households, and stabilize communities. Gender roles were clearly defined, though the daily reality was often more nuanced. Women, especially among working families, contributed labor, managed finances, and played essential roles in agriculture or trade. Men provided protection, labor, and in wealthier circles, engaged in politics, warfare, or estate management. Family life could be affectionate, chaotic, or strained, sometimes all at once. Large families were common, though childhood mortality rates meant parents often faced the heartbreaking loss of young ones. Children were expected to work from an early age, contributing to household survival long before they understood the complexities of adulthood. And let's not ignore the quiet rebellions and unexpected romances that defied tradition. Runaway couples eloped. Forbidden love affairs simmered beneath the surface, and not all relationships followed the heterosexual church-approved model we read about in sanitized history books. Medieval society wasn't uniform. It was filled with contradictions, secret passions, and the ever-present tension between personal desire and social obligation. Whether through arranged alliances, whispered affections exchanged under torchlit halls, or the gritty day-to-day labor of family survival, relationships in the Middle Ages were complex, fragile, and essential, reminding us that love, in all its messy, imperfect forms, has always been both a risk and a reward. As we reach the final stretch of this chaotic, fascinating dive into medieval life, it's worth pausing to reflect on the strange legacy that era left behind. Because while we've traveled through their muddy streets, survived their questionable hygiene, danced at their festivals, and dodged their justice system, it's easy to assume that the Middle Ages were just a distant, irrelevant chapter, locked away behind stone castles, faded manuscripts, and long-forgotten rituals. But look a little closer, and you'll see their fingerprints all over modern life, hidden in plain sight, shaping how we live, love, govern, and celebrate even today. Take language, for starters. So many of the words we toss around casually, knight, village, court, market, all trace their roots to medieval times, evolving through the centuries but carrying echoes of that rugged, unpredictable world. Our surnames, many of them were born from medieval professions, locations, or personal quirks. Smiths, bakers, carpenters, and coopers. They're all nods to ancestors who toiled away in medieval workshops, leaving a linguistic breadcrumb trail right into the present. Architecture is another lingering ghost from the past. Wander through almost any European town, and you'll stumble across crooked timbered houses, ancient stone churches, or remnants of city walls built to keep danger at bay. Cathedrals still dominate skylines, their towering spires and intricate stained glass not just symbols of faith, but of human ambition, craftsmanship, and a stubborn refusal to be forgotten. Even our celebrations carry medieval DNA. Modern weddings borrow from traditions honed in dusty villages and noble courts. The rings, the vows, the feasts, the dancing, all inherited, reshaped, and served up anew with every generation. Festivals, fairs, and public performances, those noisy, joyful gatherings owe much to medieval markets, where entertainment, commerce, and community collided in messy, wonderful ways. And let's not forget the darker legacies, the superstitions that still ripple beneath our logic, the echoes of social hierarchies that linger in subtle ways, and the ongoing human obsession with status, security, and identity that has its roots deep in medieval soil. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Middle Ages isn't what survived in stone, word, or ritual. It's the resilience of people. Despite plagues, wars, injustice, and hardship, communities endured. They loved, laughed, fought, and dreamed under the same stars that watch over us now, reminding us that history isn't just a collection of old stories. It's a mirror reflecting how far we've come, and how much of that medieval spirit still pulses through modern life. And now, here's where I turn the spotlight to you. If you've made it this far, first of all, you're officially tougher than a medieval peasant hauling barrels of ale uphill. But seriously, I want to thank you for being part of this journey, and I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Tell me your favorite part of medieval life from this video. Was it the bizarre hygiene rituals? The terrifying justice system? Or maybe the festivals filled with music, laughter, and probably too much mead? And while you're here, hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed this wild ride through history. This channel isn't just about facts. It's about building a curious global community where we explore the strangest, most fascinating corners of the past together. Your stories, your questions, your weird historical facts. They're all welcome here. So join the conversation, share your thoughts, and maybe tell us your own medieval moment. Because history isn't dead. It's just waiting for us to dig it up, dust it off, and laugh about how utterly human we've always been. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one, where we dive even deeper into the weird, wild, and unforgettable world of the past. Stay curious, stay bold, and don't forget to wash your hands, medieval style, or preferably better.